America's favorite diva, Caitlin Clark, getting talked to harshly by her coach, and all she does is bitch, whine, and moan and come back. Now, Caitlin Clark defenders, I was fouled. I wasn't fouled. She's being demonstrative, and frankly, this is just another example of her being a jackass. And we're going to talk about people criticizing me for this take, but I understand little Caitlin has the children of the corn wrapped up, and I understand a bunch of middle-aged guys can't stand me, so...
Few figures in sports media understand Indiana basketball culture better than Dan Dakich. Few athletes have transformed women's basketball faster than Caitlin Clark. That is exactly why this controversy exploded the moment those words were spoken. Because this was not a rival coach criticizing Caitlin Clark. This was not a hostile opposing fan base attacking Caitlin Clark. This was Dan Dakich, a longtime Indiana basketball personality, unleashing one of the harshest public criticisms Caitlin Clark has faced since entering professional basketball. The reaction was immediate. For months, conversations surrounding Caitlin Clark have centered around officiating, physical play, television ratings, media coverage, and coaching decisions. Caitlin Clark has become the center of almost every major WNBA debate. Every foul, every turnover, every emotional reaction, every sideline interaction becomes national news. But Dan Dakich pushed the conversation somewhere different. Dan Dakich wasn't arguing about basketball strategy. Dan Dakich wasn't debating offensive schemes. Dan Dakich wasn't questioning statistics. Dan Dakich directly attacked Caitlin Clark's behavior, personality, and leadership style. That changed everything. Because once criticism moves beyond basketball and becomes personal, fans stop debating plays and start defending identities. Suddenly, supporters of Caitlin Clark weren't hearing criticism of a point guard. They were hearing criticism of the player many believe has transformed an entire league. And as Dan Dakich continued doubling down, the backlash only grew stronger. The real question became simple. Did Dan Dakich just make a controversial sports argument? Or did Dan Dakich launch a public attack so aggressive that it could permanently damage his credibility with the very audience that helped make Caitlin Clark the biggest story in basketball?
Zip, nada. And she knows that you are an absolute menace. And you don't win enough. That's the bigger issue. I mean, you're on a 500 team now. Are the Fever tough enough to work through this? They haven't been. They had their best run without Caitlin Clark. They did. So, again, what a great country when this is what we're discussing. A woman who's never won nothing, playing in a league of angry African-American lesbians.
What made Dan Dakich's comments so explosive wasn't merely the language, it was the timing. At the exact moment that debates surrounding Stephanie White were intensifying, Dan Dakich appeared to shift responsibility away from Stephanie White and toward Caitlin Clark herself. That distinction matters. Many critics of Stephanie White have argued that Caitlin Clark's struggles are often connected to rotations, substitutions, offensive spacing, and coaching decisions. Dan Dakich presented a dramatically different interpretation. Dan Dakich argued that Caitlin Clark herself was the problem. That argument immediately created a fault line across the basketball community. Supporters of Caitlin Clark point to her production, her scoring, her playmaking, and her ability to generate unprecedented attention for the league. Dan Dakich focused on body language. Supporters of Caitlin Clark point to team construction. Dan Dakich focused on attitude. Supporters of Caitlin Clark point to coaching decisions. Dan Dakich focused on accountability. That is why the reaction became so intense, because Dan Dakich wasn't criticizing a single game. Dan Dakich was challenging the entire narrative surrounding Caitlin Clark. For years, sports fans have watched superstar athletes receive emotional protection from their supporters. Whenever criticism appears, armies of fans mobilize. Caitlin Clark's fanbase is among the most passionate in sports today. Dan Dakich knew exactly what kind of reaction his comments would generate, yet Dan Dakich continued escalating, and every additional statement made the divide larger. One side viewed Dan Dakich as someone finally saying what others were afraid to say. The other side viewed Dan Dakich as unfairly targeting the most important player in the league. The result was predictable. The controversy became bigger than basketball.
The dumbest human beings, I've always said it, when it comes to actual sports are guys like Jason Whitlock and sports writers, because they don't know jack shit. It indicts one person and one person only, and that is Caitlin Clark. Look, Whitlock's never been in a locker room for real. He says he was a some kind of football. No, he's never been in a locker room for real. Maybe to sneak a peek, maybe to get an autograph, maybe to ask a question. I don't know. But the truth of
the most fascinating aspect of this story is the psychology behind it. Throughout sports history, transformational athletes often create unusual reactions. When expectations become enormous, every weakness becomes magnified. Caitlin Clark entered professional basketball carrying expectations rarely seen in modern sports. She arrived with record-breaking television audiences. She arrived with unprecedented media attention. She arrived with superstar status before playing a professional game. That creates pressure unlike anything most athletes experience. Dan Dakich appears to view Caitlin Clark through the lens of old-school basketball accountability. From that perspective, emotional reactions toward officials and visible frustration become fair targets for criticism. Many Caitlin Clark supporters see something completely different. They see competitive fire. They see passion. They see a player carrying enormous expectations while constantly operating under a microscope. This difference in interpretation explains why the debate refuses to disappear. One observer sees entitlement. Another sees intensity. One observer sees distraction. Another sees leadership. One observer sees complaints. Another sees competitiveness. The reality is that superstars throughout basketball history have often displayed visible frustration. The difference is that Caitlin Clark exists in an era where every moment is clipped, reposted, analyzed, and debated within minutes. Nothing stays local. Everything becomes national. And when Dan Dakich delivered his criticism, he wasn't speaking into a small Indiana radio audience. He was speaking directly into one of the most passionate sports communities in America. The consequences were inevitable.
the matter is, it is a massive indictment how the other players around Clark play, are comfortable, are more competitive. When her ass isn't in there taking bad shots, being a pain in the ass, not guarding anybody, it isn't an indictment, and I'll let him finish here, of everybody else. It's an indictment of Clark, period.
This is where the story becomes truly consequential, because the debate is no longer about a single comment. The debate is about influence. Caitlin Clark represents enormous business value for professional women's basketball. Every discussion involving Caitlin Clark affects fan engagement. Every controversy involving Caitlin Clark drives headlines. Every criticism involving Caitlin Clark generates reactions across social media. That reality changes the stakes. When Dan Dakich says Caitlin Clark is holding her team back, he isn't simply evaluating basketball performance. He is challenging the central assumption held by millions of fans. That assumption is straightforward. The future of the franchise revolves around Caitlin Clark. Dan Dakich rejected that premise. Dan Dakich argued that team success without Caitlin Clark should force observers to reconsider everything. That claim instantly became one of the most controversial positions in basketball media. Because if Dan Dakich is correct, then many popular narratives collapse. But if Dan Dakich is wrong, then he has publicly attacked the league's biggest star while alienating a massive audience. Either outcome carries consequences. Media personalities survive on credibility, athletes survive on performance, franchises survive on winning. The collision between Dan Dakich and Caitlin Clark touches all three. And that is why this controversy refuses to fade, because every future Indiana Fever performance will now be viewed through the lens of this debate. Every win, every loss, every coaching decision, every Caitlin Clark performance. Everything becomes evidence for one side or the other. The stakes could not be higher.